Welcome everybody to the third and final session. Today we will be talking about how to break into investment banking and sort of explain that in greater detail. So just for a quick overview of what we've covered already so far. So some of you I know have been able to make it to the first two sessions, maybe just one of the ones prior to this, but just to quickly go over what we talked about before. The first session we talked about what finance is and what investment banking is broadly. And how to land a spot in the clubs. And so a lot of the club processes have sort of wrapped up, although I will note, some of you are dressed in business professional, because there are some clubs, like you said, brewing quant trading, brewing algo trading. We have to me, it's still going on, right? So, hopefully it's still a little bit relevant, but, a lot of the bigger ones like BVI, BAM, BHF, BIT have already wrapped. And so your next shot would be to apply during the winter quarter if you didn't make it in the first time. In the second session, we talked about what investment bankers do in more detail and also what kind of firms are out there and the reasons why people do or don't pursue investment banking. And in this session, we're going to talk in greater detail about how to actually go about that process and how to break into investment banking, right? And so just to expand a little bit on last week's session, I think it's good to touch on that, right? We talked about the different kind of bulge bracket investment banks. So these are the larger investment banks that most people recognize. And then the elite boutique investment banks, which tend to be like independent firms that only focus on banking. And then you have like the middle market firms, which focus on smaller deals and do more of them. We also talked about, what bankers do in terms of their day-to-day tasks, just to give you a little bit more of an idea of what that lifestyle is like. And then we talked about how people go into investment banking because they want to learn a lot. They want high compensation, and they want to have that optionality of being able to move into different career paths. But many more choose not to, right? Because it's a very demanding lifestyle. It takes a lot of work, and you typically work extremely long hours in banking. So with that context laid and that out of the way, I think it's important to sort of set the scene for where we are in the timeline, right? So right now we've just started. We are in our fall quarter. Many of you are first year, some of you are junior transfer, some of you are sophomores. But for many of you here, I think the majority of you likely are going to be, freshmen in your fall quarter. And so this is generally the time where you're going to be looking at the clubs, where you're going to be networking with upperclassmen to just get a better sense of how to approach banking here at UCLA. And throughout your winter, spring, and summer quarters in your freshman year, if you decide to pursue investment banking, most people try to do internships part-time so that they can build up their profile and be ready for sophomore year, your second year, which is when recruiting really kicks off. So the sophomores currently are going through the investment banking recruiting process, and they're preparing for the investment banking workshop, which is something that we're going to expand on later. And those interviews are actually happening this weekend. Do you want to just kind of give a little bit of detail and context on that? We're going to talk about it more.
On the workshop, yeah, I think we'll see it. The workshop is really good in kind of aiding you for this step, right? Recruiting for junior summer internship, it's a very complex task that requires a lot of different things to be done at the same time. The workshop kind of takes off some of the load so you can really focus on getting that off. We'll expand on that in the future slides.
Yeah, exactly, right? And then so sophomore fall, that's when people are doing the workshop things. Sophomore winter is when people really, really dive harder into full out recruiting. Most people sign either in spring or by spring. And then people do their summer internship after their junior year. And then they tend to come back after their senior year after graduation. And so that's kind of like a high level view of what that timeline might look like.
And just to clarify really quickly, it seems really weird, but yes, you are recruiting for this internship at the beginning of your sophomore year. That gets kind of confusing, but that's just how the timelines are. I think over time, things have kind of moved forward as companies try to steal the best talent early, but then everyone ends up moving it up. So that's why you kind of really start early. But as you can see, the result is you now have your offer here, and there's just a lot of relax, take it easy in the later half of your studies.
So yeah, you grind a lot if you decide to go down this route in your freshman year and your sophomore years, but the payoff is in your junior and senior years. You kind of get to relax if you want to take that route. And sort of zooming in and being a little bit more granular with what the timeline actually looks like. This is a timeline that spans from your freshman fall, so right now to your sophomore spring, so towards the end of your sophomore year. So you can see here that there are a lot of overlapping things that are going on, right? So in terms of like your general interview prep, a lot of you started this when you were recruiting for the clubs. And I think now is honestly a really great time to be networking with upperclassmen so that you can just like meet more people and learn about the finance community. In the coming months, that's when a lot of people will be starting their part-time internships. So building up their experience, building up their resumes and getting 2 to 3 relevant internships by the time they become sophomores. And then you can see that as you move into your freshman summer and your sophomore fall, a lot of that work has to do with recruiting for the investment banking workshop. And then right around the time that the workshop kicks off, by design, that's when you have recruiting for investment banks in LA and San Francisco and in New York. And so the timelines for each individual city, they'll vary a little bit. So you can see here that San Francisco tends to start a little bit earlier than New York, and New York really kicks off mostly in January, right? And you can see sort of the lighter shade colors means that it's like sort of ramping up to that point and easing into it, but not quite in full force yet. And like the solid colors means that you're like solidly in that part of the recruiting cycle. So with all that in mind, understanding where we are in the timeline, understanding what that recruiting cycle looks like, I want to talk about the most important things that you need to keep in mind when thinking about investment banking recruiting. Also, to those taking pictures, these slides will be shared, and also the recording will be shared, so you can see everything in like perfect quality. You don't have to like zoom in through the picture on your phone. And I'll be leaving a QR code if you don't have your email saved in my system. So like if you guys all received the email from earlier today, then you will get these slides. But if not, you can scan the QR code that comes out at the end. So no worries about having to take pictures and all that. But yeah, so I think it really boils down to 3 key elements which determine your success in investment banking and recruiting. And so that is your profile. So like, who are you? Your preparation. So how much did you prepare? How much work did you do leading up to recruiting? And then ultimately your performance. So how did you perform when you're doing coffee chats with bankers? How did you perform during interviews? And with your profile, the main things you want to keep into account is your GPA. That's important to keep up because there are usually like standards that firms set where they want to see GPAs usually above 3.5 for most like target schools. But given that we go to UCLA, not exactly a target school, which means that we don't have that many alumni in those banks. Something close to like 3.8 is going to be what you want to aim for. Having relevant experiences like internships, as I mentioned before, and whether you belong to certain groups. So like there are programs for women, there are programs for like underrepresented groups that can help them sort of break into investment banking. And in terms of your preparation, it really boils down into like how well are your behaviorals prepared, how well are your technical concepts prepared, and how are you organizing everything that you need to sort of keep track of to do well in recruiting. And then again, as you mentioned, in performance, that really boils down to how well you do on like networking calls and how well you do in your interviews. So let's dive into that first factor there. So that's your profile. So what do we see from the piece of paper that you submit in your application? So namely your resume, right? So your university, you go to UCLA, semi-target school. So not bad, but not as good as it could be. So if you were going to like NYU or UPenn, for example, you might be at a bit of an advantage because those schools are very established in the investment banking space. In terms of your GPA, again, we want to keep it above a 3.8 if possible. And the closer to 4, the better. But technically, if you're above a 3.5, you should still be able to pass the resume screen. Most majors are acceptable. I've seen, bio majors work in banking. I've seen English majors work in banking. But I think that the most common is going to be biz econ, econ, and math econ. I would probably guess that at least half of you guys are probably biz econ. But I always recommend going to economics because it's fewer classes and it's essentially the same degree and more people recognize it. But if you decide that you want to go with biz econ, that also makes sense too. And in terms of what you want your resume to look like, ideally you'd have maybe like 2 or 3 internships. And so those internships should be in things like venture capital, hedge funds, private equity, or investment banking. And these things are just fields that are related to investment banking and things that would prove that you have good experience and a solid enough resume to break in to the industry. And you'd also want to have like 1 or 2 extracurriculars. So usually like 1 business club or finance club. So again, we mentioned clubs like BAM or BVI, BHF or BIT. There's also like to Mead, there's like Bruins in Finance and Banking, there's Scholars of Finance. Some people are interviewing for like Bruin algorithmic trading, is that what it is? Yeah, that is. Yeah. So stuff like that, right? Having extracurriculars that relate to finance is also very helpful. And also so Cyrus here is on the investment banking workshop board, and he screened a lot of resumes recently, right? So he's looking through resumes to see which ones would make it to workshop interviews and which ones didn't. Any sort of things that came up that you thought about?
Yeah, I think this slide is like phenomenal. I think as a baseline, 3.8 GPA was typically what we looked for. That being said, if you had like a math of comp or pure math major, it gives you a little bit more leeway because, you know, we recognize the classes are harder. There, it's more like a 3.7. But realistically, GPA, like a lot of things for investment banking need to be done aside from school. But a GPA is incredibly important because if you have less than like a 3.8 or 3.7, it is very hard for you to redeem your application because that's kind of the first check box that they need to see to pass you on to the next round of, oh, okay, let's look at internships now. And if you don't meet that first checkbox, it's very hard to come back. So make sure you're keeping up with your classes and getting those good grades aside from your part-time activities like internships. I think this is really good. If you have 3 solid internships, 1 or 2 in investment banking, that's like pretty much all you can ask for. That shows that you not only are committed to the space and are willing to go out and do the work in your free time, but also you know what you're talking about, right? In interviews, they might ask you questions to gauge whether you know what the work is like, if you feel like you're ready for it, and having that experience is really going to make you more of a well-rounded candidate in that room. Other than that, I think engagement with whatever opportunities that you can get. For workshops specifically, we looked at people who weren't in those main clubs, BVI, BHF, BIT, and BAM. We looked at those people with a slightly different lens of, okay, you didn't get a lot of the mainstream resources. Did you then go out and get whatever you could to get the same experience, right? So like we run programs like the UBS Accelerator, or, you know, you guys are sitting here right now, like that's phenomenal. Like you're doing whatever you can to get as many resources as possible. And so that's what we were really looking for in the extracurricular section, right? So are you still engaging? You're not just like, oh, I didn't get into the main clubs. Oh, well, who cares? So I think just across the board, good GPA, internships in the space, and engagement with whatever insights you can get for the industry, that's something that will set your application up pretty well for the workshop.
Yeah. And I know that this might seem like a lot. It's like, oh, how can we do 3 internships by the time we're sophomores? How can we also keep up our GPA? I think one thing that really helped me is I took a lot of easier classes during my first 2 years at UCLA. So if you can take your GEs and just front load them, and especially in your freshman year, you just want to keep that GPA up. I think that's a good strategy to go with. And in terms of getting these internships, I'm also going to sort of dive a little bit further into how that works and what kind of firms these are. So on the side here is essentially kind of the same thing that I mentioned earlier in terms of like what ideal experience would look like, but just with like actual names of real firms that students at UCLA have actually worked at. So there's an investment bank in Santa Monica called Del Morgan. There's one called Montminy. These are very popular for people to intern at. And you'll recognize clubs like Scholars of Finance and Bruins in Finance and Banking, right? So if I were to see a resume like this come through to workshop, or maybe I'm a full-time investment banker and I'm screening resumes, if I saw something that looked like this, oh look, this person, she did case competitions, she has a good GPA, she did these internships, that would stand out to me as being like a qualified resume, right? And so it does seem weird, like, how do you get these part-time internships and work them, while you're a full-time student, right? It seems kind of complicated, or it seems like it may be a little bit daunting at first. It certainly was for me. But there's actually a pretty established process for that. And it generally involves emailing people at these firms and asking to hop on the phone, right? So there are hundreds and hundreds of banks like Montminy and Del Morgan that take on interns. And they're based in like cities like LA, somewhere in New York. But they tend to be smaller, and we call them regional boutiques. So regional boutiques are like the small-time internships that you do to pad your resume before you go for a bigger internship at a place like maybe Bank of America or Goldman Sachs or Lazard, right? So you have your resume filled with these smaller firms, and then you are able to sort of get that credibility to recruit for these larger companies, right? And so how does that work out, right? So from the perspective of the company, there's a bunch of like really enthusiastic college kids that are willing to work for very little money or even for free. So they get cheap labor to just help them do like research and like mundane tasks. And from the perspective of you guys, you get to put that on your resume, right? So that is kind of the reason why that ecosystem exists and why it's possible to get these internships, even if, coming in from high school, it's like, oh, I didn't expect to be doing this much. If I wanted to get into banking, like 3 internships seems like a lot, right?
And one thing you can do as well is, that seems like a very tight timeline. It can wiggle a little bit.
Yeah.
So I, for example, did an internship in the fall quarter of my sophomore year. All it is it adds a little bit more workload when you're trying to recruit for workshop and whatnot. But definitely good. I think shoot for 3 internships by winter of your sophomore year.
Yeah.
And you should be in a pretty good place.
Exactly. So you saw the example of this hypothetical person. She did one, in winter and then spring and then summer. So just like throughout the freshman year. Maybe, you find an internship, but it doesn't really happen in winter, so it doesn't start until March. So maybe you do spring, summer, and like you mentioned, like fall, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be set like rigidly within these timelines. It's just like any way that you can find to fit in 2 or 3 internships, and then you should be good. And so this is the process of actually getting those internships in the first place, right? So there are firms like, the OPES group, which is my first internship, and they're firms like Avalarian. You may or may not recognize them based on people's profiles in UCLA that you've seen. And so these, again, I mentioned, are the regional boutiques, so the smaller firms that take interns part-time for those reasons. And the process for that is basically, you want to go through the list of companies that I sent out. So I have this spreadsheet of like 200 to 300, I think maybe more than 300 of these smaller firms that you can reach out to, and you can sort of select the companies that you might be interested in. And then you would go to the LinkedIn page of these companies, and then you go to the people section. So just under that banner, there's a people section to find the employees that work there. And so you would want to find full-time employees. So you don't usually want to reach out to students or other interns. Maybe look towards like people that are analysts, people that are associates. And then you can extract their email address using a service called apollo.io, right? And again, these resources will be sent out so you can sort of see this and reference this later, but you can use Apollo.io to open their LinkedIn page and get their email address. And so once you have their email address, you can send them a cold email, and I'm going to show an example later on, just introducing yourself and then asking to hop on the phone. And when you hop on the phone, we call it a coffee chat, even though you don't usually drink coffee at coffee chats, but that's just kind of the term that we throw around for chatting with someone on the phone or in person. You kind of express your interest, you try to learn more about their background, you share more about yourself, and then you sort of imply, but you probably don't want to say explicitly that you might want to work for them. And then if they kind of pick up what you're putting down, you go through the interview process and you continue chatting with people at the firm. And so this seems kind of like informal, seems a little bit outside of the box. But when I was a freshman, I made the mistake of like going on Handshake and applying to like hundreds of jobs to try and like find an internship. I, went to like different job posting sites and like I tried to like apply it through different online systems, but most companies don't really want to take freshmen because we're kind of too young, you guys are kind of too young. But these firms are going to be more open to it, and they're directly applicable to what you need for investment banking. So this is an example of like the actual cold email I sent, like verbatim, to the OPES group, which is the first company that I interned at. So, it starts with, like, hello, Mr. whatever, right? You can usually use the first name if they're younger, and you introduce yourself, like, okay, I'm a business economics student at UCLA, and I'm really interested in investment banking. You keep it concise, you keep it respectful. You say, like, you're likely very busy, and I know you place a lot of value on your time, but would you be willing to hop on the phone with me to talk more about your career path? And obviously the majority of people will not respond to this. So you send out 100 emails, maybe you get like 15 back. But with those 15, it's about what you do with that, and it's what you do with your response rate and how you take that further, right? And then once you coffee chat them, they're like, okay, cool, let's put you in this interview process. You can see some of the questions that I actually got during my interview. So a lot of them are going to be very chill because they kind of just need bodies to just do work, and they know that you are like very young, likely first years. But sometimes they will ask you technical questions. So this would be really similar to what you may have seen during your interviews for the finance clubs, right? So they'll ask you like, what is EBITDA, for example? Like, so that's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Or like, can you walk me through a DCF, which is a kind of financial model? So you'll get questions like this. So it's essential that you prepare for that ahead of interviews that you get. And in addition to that, it's also really important to like optimize your LinkedIn profile to make sure that everything looks good and solid. So you want to have like a nice like banner image. It doesn't have to be like UCLA, but make sure it just looks nice and professional. And if possible, try and get a headshot at Royce Hall. So that's kind of the standard practice for most UCLA students. They stand in those arches, and then you kind of have that blurred background with your face there. You want to have like a clear headline. So the headline is economic student at UCLA. So something that's very straightforward. Doesn't clutter things too much, because sometimes people put a lot of words up there, like, like AI enthusiast, crypto investor, UCLA student, from whatever, right? You kind of want to just keep it clean like that. Because the finance industry tends to be a little bit more conservative. They want to keep things more low key. And so something that's clean and simple like that works really well. And you can see here the way that the companies are laid out. So, the logos are included, the companies are denoted, your job title makes sense. You also put like the group that you're in, right? So for example, in Montminy, if you did like mergers and acquisitions, then you would like put that in the subtext, but you wouldn't like write that much more. So some people put like long descriptions in their LinkedIn like experiences. Not generally needed if you want to have a LinkedIn that's optimized for finance. And you really only want to include internships there if possible, just to keep it as clean as possible. And you can see here, like in the bottom section, your school is clearly shown. Sometimes you can put your high school as well. You have your GPA there, your graduation year, and all of these things are sort of included. So that's kind of what you want your LinkedIn to look like. So if you have other stuff on there, it could be time to clean it out once you get that first internship. And moving on to the resume. So I think the resume, I would argue, is more important than your LinkedIn, because it is the piece of paper that firms and clubs will evaluate to see whether or not they want to continue the conversation with you. So there are a couple things here. I would really recommend using a font like Book Antiqua or Garamond. I notice a lot of people use like Times New Roman, and it is a very popular font, but I think that it kind of gets, you see a lot of it, and it kind of gets a little bit mundane. So if you use a font that's a little bit distinct, but still like a serif style font, so that would work well. You want to make sure you have like these clear lines that divide those sections up. These companies are correctly labeled, your roles are correctly labeled, the dates are correct, you have the location there, and very importantly, the bullets go all the way to the end, so your descriptions reach the end of the page, so there's not a ton of white space. And then you have like languages or certifications at the bottom, and your interest section is also pretty important, because you can have like conversations based on that. So a lot of people will look at the interest line and they say, ooh, this person likes to make like handmade pasta, right? Maybe I'll ask a little bit about that. So this is kind of what you want your resume to look like ideally. Yeah.
Is it important for the bottom part to also go on?
Yeah. You want to make as much of your resume just fill out the page as much as possible. So if we see like any blank space, or like it doesn't go all the way to the end, that can sort of deduct points away from like getting towards like a perfect resume, for example. So yeah. So now we sort of established what's important about your profile. Then we move on to the next part, which is your preparation. So how are you preparing for the recruiting process? And so a lot of this will have to do with practicing for interviews. And so that'll be like your technical preparation, your behavioral preparation, your market preparation, and your like firm preparation. So to expand on like the technical part, it's like, do you know the finance concepts like accounting or valuation? Behaviorals would be like, can you answer questions that they ask to sort of gauge your fit for the role and how well you'd fit in the culture. In terms of markets, like how well do you know what's going on in the stock market? Like, do you know about like deals that are going on, things that are important to investment bankers? And then like firm specific preparation would be things like, why do you want to work for our company? Like, what is special about our company? And those are questions that you'll get a lot in these kinds of interviews. And then you have networking. So like, have you built up a support system around you at UCLA? Do you have like mentors that can help you through this process? Have you spoken to people in the industry? And then systems of organization, right? So like, how do you keep track of everything? What sort of documents, spreadsheets, trackers do you use to just make sure that everything is on the right path? And so here we can sort of talk about the technical portion of that. So I think this is something that people tend to focus a lot on. And so the key topics that you're really going to know, that you really need to know, is accounting, enterprise value and equity value, valuation and DCF, M&A, and LBOs, right? So if this doesn't mean anything to you right now, that's okay. It's kind of a natural starting point. But if you want to recruit for investment banking, it's really important that you sort of gain familiarity with all of these topics. And the good thing is that there is a guide for all of them, and it's called the Breaking Into Wall Street Guides. And these are freely available because I can send them to you and it's in my folder. And really the best way to learn these concepts, at least in my opinion, and I think this is the path that most people go down, is just to fully read the guides that are there. So these guides will usually be like 40 to 50 pages of like actual content and then some practice questions afterwards, right? So that's kind of what you're looking at in terms of how much you're going to be reading. And, just reading those guides, practicing those questions at the end is kind of the most established way to learn the technicals, right? And I think the best way to really, really learn it and drill it down and be interview ready is to do mock interviews. So if you meet people in this workshop or you meet people in the finance community that are willing to do mock interviews with you, that's a great way to learn these technicals and practice delivering them. And another thing that I would recommend is like really spacing out your learning. So rather than cramming it in like right before you have an interview, if you say like, took 1 hour a day, for 3 months just to study these and really space out your learning over time, that helps with recall and it helps with really embedding that learning. And another thing that I really like to do is something called passive learning. So if you were just like walking to class or brushing your teeth or doing your laundry and you have like a podcast that's talking about these sort of concepts, that's also a great way to learn these concepts over time. And then you have the behavioral questions. So people tend to think that these are kind of easier. And so like, when you hear, oh, that interview was very behavioral, that sounds like a good thing, but behavioral questions can get tricky. And I would argue that they're more important than technicals because it really tells the interviewer how well they feel like you would fit into the firm, right? So there are fit questions like, like what do your friends like or dislike about you? Like what are your biggest strengths and weaknesses to try and gauge what kind of person you are? And then there's like competency questions, like, what makes you qualified? Like what skills do you have? And then you have like situational questions that try to get at like, what are your values? Like how do you use your judgment in different situations? So like, how did you overcome a challenge? Can you tell me about a time that you demonstrated leadership? And so nailing these questions are going to be very important because beyond being good at technicals, you want to make sure that the person interviewing you likes you. And then moving on to like your market and firm questions. So these are another sort of section of questions that you will probably get if you interview for investment banking, although I will say there's less of an emphasis. I think the main things you want to focus on are your behaviorals and your technicals, but this is also still really important to know. So if you are applying or like interviewing for a specific firm, so like take like JP Morgan, for example, you want to make sure you understand like who are the key people there, like how is their stock doing? What is the history of the company and like what are the unique points that make it different from other banks, right? Because one question that you might get is like, okay, why do you want to work for JP Morgan and you don't want to work for Morgan Stanley? Why not go to Goldman Sachs? Like what makes us special, right? So beyond the unique points about the firm itself, I think one thing that's really helpful is like talking about the people you've spoken with at the firm. So you can be like, yeah, I spoke with John on the energy team and he talked about how the culture at JP Morgan is especially collaborative. And that's one thing that really drew me in. And so that's an example of a kind of answer you can give to that sort of question. In terms of the market prep, some of you may have experienced this in your interviews with the finance clubs, but you kind of have to get a sense of like, or you have to be able to understand, how are like stock markets doing, for example. Where are they headed? Are they going to go up? Are they going to go down, stay flat? And it's a good idea to review like indexes or indices, like, the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ. And then you also have to know about like transactions that happened recently, right? So like what is an M&A deal that happened? So if a company got bought or sold, you might get asked a question like, can you tell me about one of those kinds of deals? Or like an IPO, which is when a company gets put onto the stock market. And so you might get questions about that because that's important to the kind of work that investment bankers do. And then you might get asked questions about like the industry, right? So it's like, okay, why are you interested in doing technology investment banking? Or like, can you tell me about a trend that happened in the technology space? These are the kinds of industry questions that you might get in your interviews. And onto the other part, which is like building your network, right? So like, who are the people that are going to support you through the recruiting process? Who are the people that you can lean on? Who are your mentors? And who are the people that are going to be beside you as you go through this, right? So I think the greatest strength of UCLA and its finance community is the fact that I think it's relatively tight-knit and people want to support each other. And I think that's something that you guys should take full advantage of. So if you have a lot of friends at UCLA, it's great because you can do mock interviews with them. They can provide moral support. If you happen to know a lot of people, maybe you can ask a UCLA student who worked at a particular firm. And then you can ask them for like specific insights into how to interview for that firm. And having mentors that are like maybe 1 or 2 years older than you can be really helpful when you're going through situations that they've gone through before so that they can offer you advice. And then on top of that, right, having strong systems of organization, right? So it seems like this might not be the most important point, but I think for me personally, this is something that helped me feel a lot more in control of my recruiting process, just because I was able to keep track of everything that was going on. So having like a recruiting tracker, like what banks are you targeting, which firms have you spoken with, is important to have. Having like a networking tracker, so like who are the people I've spoken with at each one of these firms, how did those chats go, like what did we talk about, and an application tracker, so like what have I applied to so far, what are some firms I might need to network with that I might not have networked with enough, right? And so organizing all of your notes, organizing all of your information is a really, really great way to just stay ahead of things and have clarity when you're going through the recruiting process. And so the next part will be about your performance, right? So it really boils down to networking and interviewing, right? So why do people do coffee chats? Why is there this thing of like doing coffee chats before you, get an interview at an investment bank? So because so many people apply to investment banks, it's like almost impossible for them to like filter out resumes like well and find the candidates that they really want to talk to. And they want to be able to sort of speak with people that they think that they can vibe with on a behavioral level. So as a student, as an applicant, what you're going to do is you're going to reach out to people in these investment banks, ask to coffee chat them. And if you make a good impression, they might like push you on to an interview, right? And so that kind of also begs the question, like how many coffee chats do you need to do? So unfortunately, there isn't really like a set number. It'll really depend on how your recruiting process goes and which city you recruit for. So for example, if you were going for like an LA firm, because we have such strong connections with firms in LA, maybe you do like 25 or 50 of these chats. And each of these chats usually will last from like 20 to 30 minutes long. Maybe you'll do a couple a day during recruiting. But if you're going for like New York, for example, maybe you'll do upwards of 100 of these coffee chats. And so it'll vary a lot. And then the next part is like interviewing. I mean, I guess you're about to do a lot of interviews for workshop. Do you want to sort of touch on that a little bit?
For sure. I think interviewing is really going to vary from bank to bank. I think one important thing to note is the fact that these coffee chats are like an informal first round where they're kind of just asking you behaviorals. They're trying to get a feel for who you are as a person. I think beyond the fact that it's competitive, it also serves as a kind of estimate for like how would you do in the actual role, because you're going to be working with these bankers for like 16 hours a day. They want to make sure that you're someone that they can at least talk to for 30 minutes without, wanting to throw themselves out of a building. That is something that someone actually told me on a call. And so once you make it to interviews, that means they've screened you for behaviorals. They've decided, okay, this is a person that I think could do well in a social setting, but let's see if they've put in the work to study the technicals and to know everything that they're talking about. So I think they'll usually start off with a behavioral section where they'll ask you to tell them about yourselves, and maybe a few of those kind of questions that we put up earlier, either market knowledge or general fit questions, and then move into more of a technical section. And what this is going to consist of is pretty much exactly what you can find in the Breaking into Wall Street guides. Even though finance and especially investment banking, it seems like it's kind of all over the place and there's no set path, one thing that is almost guaranteed is the fact that the technical questions that they will ask are very, very standardized. And you will get these guides from Knoton and you can start studying them and just stay up to date with all of your knowledge from those guides, and you will know exactly what you'll be asked in the interview room. I think that's one of the most important parts that a lot of people miss, is they focus too much on trying to figure out what they want to do, but then don't actually do the technical research and knowledge studying to actually back that up. So, as not mentioned though, technicals are not as important as behaviorals. I completely agree with that. From what I've heard, it's more of a checkbox, just like your GPA is a checkbox. Did this person get at least 3.7? And then they move on to what's more important. Technicals are also like a checkbox where they're like, okay, did this person put in the work to study what they need to study? And if it's a check on that, then they evaluate your behaviorals and evaluate you as a person and decide if they want to extend you an offer. I think that's something that's really important to note. So make sure you put a lot of thinking into why you're doing this, so that you come across as a very well-rounded candidate.
Yeah. And so with that, we'll kind of expand on that first part there, which is networking, and then talk more about like how to nail. Yeah, what's up?
Yeah, I have a question. I think you mentioned about we should not really explicitly mention we wanted to work with a firm in the coffee chat.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, when we do the interview, do we submit the application on our own?
So yeah, I think that's a good question.
I coffee chat with somebody else in the firm, and they connect this applicant to somebody like a normal employer.
Yeah. So with that earlier point you said about like not explicitly saying that you want to work for the firm, that's going to be for your small time internships. So if you're thinking about like your regional boutiques and you're trying to build up experience over time as like a freshman, for those ones you kind of have to network your way in, and those processes are not formal. But when we talk about like a formal process, let's say you're applying to like a big firm, you're gonna submit your application to Evercore, or you submit your application to like Bank of America, for example. You go through their like online system, you submit your resume, and then once your resume is like in their system, and let's say like you send a cold email and they respond, and you have a good chat with them. So I know this for Bank of America specifically, like, and this is probably similar for other firms. They have like a big spreadsheet where they keep track of the people that they coffee chatted with, and they like write notes. Maybe they'll rate the conversation, and if they like you enough, maybe they'll like bump you up in the system, right? And so like Bank of America, for example, has that system, I believe, in place. Other firms might do it differently, but that's generally how it works. So like you'll do the coffee chat, they're not going to tell you what they put down about you, and it sometimes feels like you're putting in a lot of effort and it goes to a black box. But over time, if you have enough chats, you've made a good enough impression, then you could sort of expect to see like maybe like a first round interview come into your inbox. Does that make sense?
Oh, so like they'll send interview without me applying or submitting?
No, you would submit your application to their portal, and then you do the coffee chats, and then if those coffee chats go well, then they'd send you that interview for like a bigger firm like Bank of America. But if you're going back to a firm like the random ones you reach out to on LinkedIn, like Takanaka, for example, that's just like a local LA bank. You're not going to put your resume in the system, but you're going to network with them and try to get your way into that company and work there part-time. Whereas with a company like Bank of America, you want to work there for your junior summer. So that's a summer internship after your junior year and before your senior year. And so with that, then you come back full-time if you get the return offer and do full-time investment banking. Yeah.
I also think it's important to note that like they know, even though you're not explicitly saying I want to work for you, either for a part-time role or for a sophomore or a junior summer internship, they know what you're doing, right? Because they went through the exact same path to get where they are. So it's kind of this understanding of like reaching out to someone and saying, hey, I want to learn more about your experiences and what you do is synonymous for I want to help you do that, right? You just don't have to explicitly state it.
All right. And so now, when we expand on that first part there, networking. So the bedrock of networking is sending cold emails. And so this is probably going to be the bulk of the work that you do when you do recruiting, because it honestly just takes a lot of time. It's a very manual process. And it sort of is the main thing that you're going to be spending time on when you do recruiting, right? So when you want to send a cold email to do networking, basically what you'd want to do is you'd find like a full-time employee at that bank, and then you'd go on LinkedIn and check out their page. You would, get their email address from Apollo, so similar with to what you did with the small-time firms, and then you'd send them like a respectful email asking if they'd be available to chat. And so again, most people will not respond to you, but for those who do, you can set up a time and confirm like your availability, and then you'd want to send a Google Calendar invite once a time has been set. So that's pretty important because you want to make sure that your coffee chat is showing up on their calendar. And when you do coffee chats with upperclassmen in UCLA, for example, like you always want to send a Google Calendar as well, just so that they could keep track of things and like remember that they need to set aside some time to talk to you. So if any of you ever reach out to me for a coffee chat, I'll probably ask you, hey, like, can you also send a Google Calendar? And so I'll give you a little bit of a look of what that calendar invite should look like, right? And so I guess that also begs the question, like, who should you reach out to? What kind of person should you reach out to? So you want to find anyone you have any sort of connection with. So usually a good place to start is UCLA alumni, maybe people from your high school, maybe there are people from your hometown, maybe you're in a fraternity or sorority. Reaching out to people there makes sense because they're more likely to respond to you if you have some sort of connection with them. When do you reach out? Obviously this will happen during like recruiting season, so when you're in sophomore year, during your winter quarter. But in terms of like when you send it during the day, there are sort of like competing theories for this. So I usually like to send mine at around like 11 a.m. because that's when they're kind of done with that morning rush and they're kind of waiting to get into lunch. Some people would do it like 2 p.m. Like after they finish eating lunch. I think the only rule you really want to follow is just make sure not to send it outside of work hours. So you don't want to send a cold email at 2 a.m. And usually Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays work best because on Mondays, people are kind of catching up from the weekend. On Fridays, people are going out and they don't really want to, respond to cold emails. So you want to find that middle part of the week. And so in a cold email, like what should you say? I'm going to show an example of one, but I can sort of cover that quickly. So you want to make sure you introduce your name, your major, talk about the reason why you're reaching out, and then maybe have like a little specific thing about why you're reaching out to them. So you can be like, oh, I saw that you went to my high school and I wanted to learn more about your path, given that we have this shared background, right? And you also want to attach your resume as well. One thing I also really want to point out, and this also applies for looking for small-time internships on top of the big-time internships, you want to send follow-ups. I usually go with at least 2 follow-ups. So if they don't respond the first time, you can come back around and be like, hi, just wanted to check in again to see if you were available for a chat. No worries if you're busy. And I found that some people would often respond on the first or the second follow-up. And so it's really important to be like persistent, but you probably don't want to bother them too much and send too many follow-ups. So I personally like to cap it at 2. So this is an example of a cold email that I sent that eventually led me to getting my offer. So I reached out to somebody who went to Berkeley. So you'll see there, I introduced my name. I talked about my major and that I'm interested in doing investment banking at JPM. And then I said, oh, since you also went to a UC, recently graduated from Berkeley, I'd love to hear more about your career if you had some time. So he did not respond to this first email. He didn't respond to the second email, but he responded to the third email because he was like, oh, you followed up twice. That's good persistence. I have a little bit of spare time now. Why don't we hop on the phone and chat? And so one thing that I will say is bankers can be kind of hard to get a hold of because they can become very busy very quickly. So it's essential that you respond very quickly to their emails. I usually aim for under 5 minutes in terms of response time, so that you can really get them while they're still at their desks and while they're still at their emails.
I think what I've heard more commonly is under 30 is like normal. Under 5 is perfect because like they will be able to immediately respond to you. But like, you don't need to be glued to your phone. So I think realistically under 30 is what I've heard a lot of. But the quicker the better is the point.
The quicker the better, generally speaking. I think 30 is perfectly reasonable and acceptable. But if you just really want to be super hardcore, make sure you never miss anybody. If you go for like a really fast response, that just increases the likelihood that you're able to catch them. But yeah, so don't be stressed if it's like, oh no, it's been 7 minutes. I'm lost already, right? Just get to them whenever you can and try to be as prompt as possible. And so to that point about sending the calendar invite, this is kind of what you're going to want that to look like. So you would usually put the either your name first or the other person's name first. I think maybe it makes sense to put your name first so they can see like who they're talking to immediately on their calendar. And then you'd have the little like greater than, less than sign there, which is kind of like convention that you see a lot in these invites. And then you do like coffee chat. You'd make sure that the time is right. So a 30-minute coffee chat seems about right. In the location, you can sort of put like maybe your phone number, and then you want to make sure that you've invited them as a guest so that they can see it on their calendar as well. In the description, you want to say like your name and your phone number to call their name and their phone number at the time. And so because I was recruiting for New York, but I was calling from LA, I'd be like, I'm going to call you at 5:30 my time, but that's going to be 8:30 your time, right? So just being very clear, having all these details down, paying attention to all of this and making sure that the invite looks perfect. And also attaching your resume. I also made sure to like send like a reminder like 1 hour before. And so it seems like it might be a little bit OD to like have every single detail down set. But in investment banking, it's really important that you have attention to detail and professionalism. So having a really well formatted calendar invite is pretty important to making sure you make a good first impression, right? Before they even meet you. If they see a perfect calendar invite, that already sets like a good tone. So when you're actually in a coffee chat, my recommendation, you always want to show up exactly when you say you will. So if you have a 5:30 setup, I wouldn't call them at 5:27 because maybe they're caught off guard, maybe they're doing something first. I would just call them exactly at 5:30. Maybe give them like 15 seconds after the minute strikes, just to give them a little bit of time to prepare. You want to like greet them, do a little bit of small talk beforehand. You want to ask about their experiences, and you want to make sure that you're also telling them things about you as well so they remember who you are. And you want to make sure that the conversation does not feel like an interview, and you want to make it like feel natural, right? So if you think about it from the perspective of the investment banker, they don't want to just be peppered with questions. Like you ask, like, oh, can you tell me about why you decided to, work at this firm, and then ask something completely unrelated in the next question. That kind of gives them whiplash, and it doesn't really feel like a natural conversation. So you want to try to keep that feeling as as natural and having like as good of a flow as possible, right? And so if you make a good impression and they liked talking to you, at the end, you want to ask them if there's someone else that you can speak with, so you can continue to chat with more people at the firm, and maybe they'll like refer you and pass you on to someone else on their team if they like you. And so the more people you talk to, the more name recognition you get, the more your name appears in the system, and the more likely you are to land that interview and get that process. Yeah.
Are you doing this last part in the coffee chat itself or in the follow-up email?
Oh yeah. So I tend to do it in the coffee chat itself. You can also do it in the follow-up email. And that's actually a really important point. Every time you do a coffee chat, you want to make sure to send a thank you email afterwards, being like, thank you so much for your time. And, I really liked it when we talked about like X, Y, and Z. So like pointing out specific things from that conversation. And then you can add in a section that's just, like, oh, and thanks again for offering to connect me with another person. It's a huge help. And so that serves as a little reminder for them to like bump you on to the next person. So you can do that when you talk to them like physically, and then you can also do that as a reminder in that follow-up email as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's up?
Is there, should you only call them, confirm, like, could you use a Google Meet or a Zoom?
Yeah, you can use a Google Meet or a Zoom. Sometimes Google Meet might not be compatible with their system, so you just want to make sure just in case. I think Zoom works across the board with most people, but I think a lot of people do prefer to do like a call if they're like, like walking somewhere, or they're like busy doing something and they might not necessarily want to like show their face. But if they're like, yeah, feel free to send a Zoom invite for this time, then you do a Zoom, right? And when you're on that Zoom, you want to make sure you have a dress shirt on, or, just like a business professional. If you're like a girl, honestly, I think it'd be the same thing for girls and guys. Just have something that's like nice and professional when you're on the Zoom. And just make sure you make a good impression and you look like cleaned up for a Zoom call. And so when you have your chats, you also want to make sure that you're keeping track of your chats, right? So this is an example of like, a networking tracker. So you'll see like the name of the person, you'll have their email set, you'll have like the location that they're at, so like which office do they work at the firm, the date that they, you chatted them, a rating, like how well did you think the conversation went. So like, if you had like a 9 out of 10 conversation with like Isaac, for example, then maybe you reach out to Isaac again when something else comes up. And then you also have notes on the side. So that's a little bit cut off, but those are like actual notes that I wrote from other coffee chats that I did, at least like the first part, right? So it includes details like, oh, like how did we know this person, or how did we get connected? Like this person's a UCLA and BHF alum, right? So I talked with them. Or maybe they were originally from Hong Kong, right? So I'm also from Hong Kong, and so like I talked with them. So like having notes about them and then keeping track of this is also very important. Goes back to that idea of like systems of organization. And so that is the part about networking. And now what about with interviews, right? So I think with interviews, you want to think about these like those key sort of spheres that you want to strike, right? So with behavioral questions, I think the key here is practice. So do a lot of mock interviews, practice walking through your answers. Maybe you like record yourself on photo booth, or talk through questions in the mirror, and then you refine those answers over time. And I think it's important to come up with maybe like 3 to 5 key stories that you can use to answer like those tell me about a time questions, right? So that you don't get caught off guard and you can adapt them to different questions that you receive. In terms of like your technical questions, you want to make sure that you're answering them clearly and concisely, and you want to avoid rambling so that you don't like open yourself up to being attacked if you bring up something that you can't elaborate on. And I think that the one thing you really want to go for is developing like a strong, like intuitive understanding of the concepts. So not just like regurgitating what you've seen in the guides and sort of just memorizing what they say. You want to sort of understand the fundamental concept behind that. In terms of answering questions about the market or like industries or the firm, if you read up on the markets and you pay attention to the news, you have news alerts on your phone, maybe you'll listen to a podcast about current events, you begin to develop a lot of context and understanding over time, and you get to, have a strong understanding of what's going on, and that can really help you in answering market questions. And a lot of times, one thing that people really overlook is like, it's really good to have an opinion on what's going on. So do you think this trend is good for this company or bad for this company? Do you think the markets are going to go up down and why, right? So having that justification and having an opinion makes your answer more compelling. Do you also want to, is there anything else you want to add to this one, given that you're going to be doing a lot of interviews soon?
Yeah, I think a big thing as well is getting practice with questions that you don't know how to answer. I think, like you will see in workshops or in workshop interviews, that the questions are going to be significantly more difficult than what's in the guides. And you know, in a random interview, even though most of them are going to be from the guides or related to the guides, you're going to see something inevitably that you don't know how to answer. And I think being able to have put yourself in those shoes of like, okay, I might not know how to answer this question, but here's how my thought process goes, and staying calm, I think that's a really important skill that is very important to get down earlier rather than later, because all of your interview processes are, they're not just trying to gauge your understanding of technicals, but they're trying to understand you as a person, right? Are you easily irritated? Do you stay calm under pressure, right? These are the kind of things that are important for an investment banker, so they're going to want to test them in the interviews themselves. So my advice is, once you feel like you have a solid understanding of something, throw it into ChatGPT and be like, ask me a question I couldn't possibly answer, and then just try to answer it. I think that's a really good exercise that it's not fun, but it's necessary.
100%. And so as we zoom out, we can sort of take a look at like, what does the process for like applying to an actual like firm look like now that we sort of understand how all this works, right? So at the first stage, you have the application. So you're actually submitting your, your resume and your information to their system. And it is very competitive. There are a lot of people that apply to this. So for example, during my recruiting cycle, within the first 48 hours of the application opening, over 90,000 students applied for positions at the firm. And so you can sort of extrapolate that further. In total, maybe the firm received 200,000 or 300,000 resumes, right? So that's a pretty crazy number. But let's say that in total, let's say for like investment banking, for example, they get like 100,000 applications. So some firms will have something called a selective hire view. So what is a hire view? It's basically like a video interview where they pull up a question on the screen and you have to answer it to like a video and make a recording and send that in. And so that's something that's pretty common. A lot of people dislike them. I'm not a big fan of hire views. They're kind of just like annoying to have. Sometimes you don't feel like you did it correctly. But that's how a lot of firms are doing their interview process now. And then so from that pool of like, let's say 100,000 applications, if it's like a selective hire view, so like only a few people get that, maybe only 1 to 15% will get that video interview. And so let's say like, for example, like 5,000 finish that. Maybe from that pool, only 1,000 of them are actually gonna get like interviewed, probably fewer, right? And then so after like, a lot of those candidates go through the first round, usually they whittle that down to maybe like 500, and those people are passed on to something called a super day. So a super day is like your final interview usually, and it's a bunch of interviews back to back. So like super interview day, just multiple in quick succession. And so like you usually speak to like multiple interviewers, maybe like over 3. And those interviews can last for over 2 hours. They'll ask you behaviorals, they'll ask you technicals, and it can be a pretty intense process. And so like after that dust is settled, larger firms will probably settle on a class size of maybe like 100 interns. And so you've gone from 100,000 people that applied to 100 people that got accepted. And then so essentially if you make it in, you would be like 1 in 1,000. That's kind of like the numbers that we're looking at here. In terms of maximizing your chances, I think one thing that we always want to emphasize is you want to apply early. So the vast majority of these applications are going to be reviewed on a rolling basis. So these firms look at resumes as they come in. Whereas like with the clubs, it's not rolling. You just submit it and they review it all at once. These firms will see them as they come in and sort of decide from there, right? And so if you can submit your application within the first 24 to 48 hours, that does make a material difference in your chances. So a mentor of mine was telling me about the process at Bain Capital, which is a very prominent private equity firm. And the recruiter told them that 50% of their incoming interns applied to the posting within 24 hours of it opening. So that kind of shows like the time pressure there. Similar thing happened at Goldman Sachs, where they had like rounds of super days where there's some people that submitted earlier, some people that submitted later. In the earlier super day round, they just took a lot of people, and so there are no spots left for the people that submitted their applications later. So it's very important that you submit your application soon. So how do you make sure that you get them soon, right? They're like, what systems are in place? So there are apps called Recruit You and Adventus And these are companies that sort of keep track of when applications open, and they'll send out like an email blast, or like sometimes there's Slack channels for this. You also have like Handshake, which is something that UCLA uses. And I follow like recruiters on LinkedIn. So like sometimes I'll open up LinkedIn and I'll see a posting come up. And I think that this current workshop board has done a really good job of like sending in job postings as they see them. So if you have your notifications on in Slack and you see like a job posting come in, you probably want to just apply to that as soon as possible. And so once you've actually reached the stage where you get an offer, you can sign the offer that you get, and most people just receive one and then they sign it and then they're done. But some people decide to like leverage their offer. So what does it mean to leverage, right? So essentially that means saying like, let's say you get an offer from firm B, and then you go to like firm A. You're like, hey, I got this offer from firm B, but firm A, you're my top choice. So can we do an interview? And a lot of the times that actually works out, and like they agree to interview you. And so in that sense, you've leveraged that offer you've gotten to get into another interview process, right? And so like once you get your first offer, everything else moves faster, and like the firms really want to jump on you because they want to find the best talent. And the fact that you've gotten an offer already is sort of like a stamp of approval that you are talented and that you can pass the interview. So one example from a friend of mine who went through recruiting is this process here. So he got an offer from SVB, which is a now defunct bank. And he used that. He brought that to Bank of America. He was like, hey, I got this offer. Can we do a super day? Bank of America said yes. He got that offer. And then he took that to offer to Lazard and Centerview, and he eventually got that offer from Lazard. And so that's one way you can sort of turn an offer that maybe you don't exactly want to settle with and try to bring that a little bit further. But I think it's also helpful to think about this whole process from the perspective of your interviewers, right? So there have been some like articles released that have sort of talked about what it's like from the perspective of the people at the banks, right? So one thing that they really point out is it's not a very accurate process. A lot of the times it just boils down to vibes and how they feel about you. And the fact that how you speak is more important than what you speak. So again, it just points to the fact that your behaviorals are going to be very important. And sometimes people will like strike you down for like really, really mundane reasons, right? So in this thread, he talked about how like one person was struck down because he smiled so much that it looked fake, or she was too quiet, or she seemed too confident, or he tried too hard on the technicals. So you can see that it can get really random. And it's often hard to anticipate like what interviewers are looking for and how they feel. Another thing that's also really important is the idea of like being polished. So you can like remember, you can practice all these behaviorals, you can, learn all the technicals, but if you can't convey it succinctly and concisely and give it in a way that's articulate and compelling, that doesn't really help, because you need to be able to explain complex things in a simple way. You need to be able to have like good communication skills, and you need to be able to have like strong delivery in order to do well in interview processes. And it's that idea of being like polished, right? And so now that we have that in mind, in terms of, what you should be doing or like how your performance factors into everything, I think we can sort of turn our gears to like an action plan. So what will these next quarters look like for you if you decide to pursue investment bank? So right now you're in your fall quarter, right? I think like one of the main things that we really want to be thinking about is like talking with upperclassmen, like reaching out to sophomores or juniors, seniors, and getting their advice, looking into pursuing internships, part-time things through that process that I just mentioned, and like finding ways to boost your resume, right? So maybe you can do like a certification like Bloomberg Market Concepts, and there are opportunities like BVI's JP Morgan case competition that you can engage in to just add that to your resume. Then once January rolls around and you get into your winter quarter, maybe you continue the internship you started in fall quarter, or you start a new one, and you also have the opportunity to recruit for the clubs. And you obviously need to like do interview prep for that, so that's something else you can sort of look forward to for winter quarter. In terms of your spring quarter, maybe you do like another internship, right? Or maybe you do your second one. Depending on what it is, you just kind of want to have 2 to 3 relevant experiences by the time you become a sophomore. And then around the spring quarter is probably when you want to be preparing for the investment banking workshop, right? So we'll go into more detail as to what the workshop is in the next slide. But I think we sort of alluded to it. It's like a program that helps you recruit for investment banking. And then in your summer quarter, hopefully you can do like an internship full-time, because this is going to be your one opportunity to do like a full-time internship that's not like inhibited by the fact that you're a student, because you have that summer free. And in the summer, you probably want to be like really seriously preparing for the workshop, So this is what a lot of the current sophomores went through and what their summers were like. And so this next part here, we'll talk more about the workshop, and Cyrus here is on the current workshop board. I was on the workshop board last year, and I was the director of that, but I kind of want to let him sort of take it away and explain more about why that's important.
Yeah, exactly. I think you guys now have a pretty good sense of what it takes to recruit into investment banking. Obviously, getting those coffee chats in, making those impressions, getting through interviews, having the technical prep down. And as I mentioned earlier, what Workshop does is kind of take some of that load off you. And what that means is the bread and butter of Workshop is to put you in front of bankers. Rather than you having to cold email to people and try and get them on the phone, what we do is we actually bring in firms. So we will do outreach to 50 plus firms in LA, in San Francisco, in New York, and be like, hey, we've assembled some of the top talent at UCLA. We know we're not necessarily a target, but if you just take a look at these kids and give them a shot. And so we'll bring in the banks, give you an opportunity to talk to these bankers in a very small and confined setting, and then follow up with those bankers and have those kinds of warm impressions in place. I think it's a way to level up your coffee chat game because you already have that in-person connection with someone and you're much more likely to get that first round interview rather than having to send out 100 emails. So I think that's the biggest thing that Workshop does. On top of that, for those more like structured programs at Bulge Brackets and in New York, we send out resume books so that when they're looking at a list of UCLA kids, they're going to have your resume right in front of them. I think it's just a really good way to get a very, very good impression with a lot of different bankers without having to reach out to hundreds in a cold email, right? That being said, statistically speaking, not everyone in this room is going to get into Workshop. And as I said, it just takes some of the load off you so that you can focus on behavioral prep or technical prep or figuring out exactly what you want to do. But it is not a must-have, right? It is a would like to have. So I think give it everything you have to prepare for Workshop, because worst case, if you're ready for Workshop interviews, then you're at a level technically where you're also ready for real interviews, right? So you're gonna have to do the prep regardless, just move it up a little bit, and then Workshop can do a lot to really help you in that networking process. Is there any questions on that? Cool.
Yeah. And the workshop board this year did a great job. Like you can see that there are a lot of information sessions planned. They have I think the last time I checked, there's over 44 info sessions planned with firms like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, or Evercore. And they have trips planned out to New York and San Francisco. And so these initiatives are things that are newer. And I think that it's a big differentiator and one of the biggest reasons why UCLA is doing much better as a school in terms of recruiting. But beyond the support that you're going to receive at UCLA, there are also programs out there that you can join to support you in recruiting beyond what you'll find here, at our own college, right? So if you are a woman, there is a program called Girls Who Invest, and it's a very strong program that places you into different roles in investing. There is like SEO career for like underrepresented people from low-income backgrounds, maybe first-generation students. And then there's programs like Access Distributed, which is aimed at helping students that belong to non-target schools recruit for investment banking. And then you have the programs that firms like Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan set up that are aimed at helping like underrepresented groups recruit for banking. And so there are a lot of programs out there that can support your recruiting journey. And it's really just a matter of finding them and being able to identify these programs and applying to them at the right time. And this will usually happen during the beginning of your sophomore year, which is why we sort of included this before we talked about what you can sort of expect to see when you are a sophomore. And so I think we sort of covered a little bit about workshop and why that's important for your fall quarter. But we wanted to emphasize that, in the workshop, there are approximately like 35-ish students that join that program, but nearly 150 people apply. So like numerically, not everyone that applies gets to be a part of workshop, but the people that don't make it in still generally choose to recruit. So if you are a part of workshop, you'll go to those information sessions, you'll engage with the program, and you'll benefit from that. But if you're not a part of workshop, it's kind of like business as usual. You continue to send cold emails, you do coffee chats, and you try to prepare for recruiting, which fully kicks off in your sophomore winter quarter. right? So here you're going to be sending a lot of cold emails and doing coffee chats. And so again, we mentioned that that's the main engine driving your recruiting forward. That's how you make progress. That's how you land interviews. And then once you do interviews and you're adequately prepared for them and you go through those stages, you can get to that point where you're getting offers and signing them, or maybe leveraging them for other offers. And so this is increasingly happening in like late January, sometimes in February. I personally signed my offer in March, but that was several years ago. So the recruiting timelines have moved up a little bit, but that's sort of the time frame that we're looking at here. And so this is kind of a helpful sort of summary with all of that just on one page, all the information that we mentioned earlier. And another thing that I really want to sort of point out that I think is important to remember, there are a couple of key applications that open up in your sophomore year that are important to keep track of, right? So we talked a lot about the investment banking workshop, so I think we've covered that in adequate depth. But there is also something called the Sharp Fellows program, which is set up by the UCLA Alumni Affairs. And one big thing that they do is the New York Trek, which is just taking students out to New York to visit firms in person. So that's a pretty good program to be a part of. And then actually after recruiting, there's something called the value investing concentration, which is a concentration offered by the economics department that lets you get like hands-on experience with investing in classes, which is kind of rare because we don't have a business school, we don't have a ton of great finance classes, and the value investing program is a great way to get involved with that. Are you in value investing, by the way?
Yeah, I actually just came from value investing concentration class. It's really cool. It gives you a lot more insights into financial markets, brings in a lot of speakers. Just today we had a speaker who is potentially one of the most well-known short investors. I'm not necessarily as involved in that space, so I don't really know, but they connect you with a lot more real insights beyond just a regular economics program. I would also heavily advise you to join what's called the Bruin Development Academy. You might see some emails about it, otherwise I would search it up. And they're kind of building it out as a precursor to the value investing concentration. And it's essentially like one session a quarter. I did this in my sophomore year, which was really helpful. And you get to kind of see what the program does, speak with the people who run it, and kind of get your name out there so that your application for the actual concentration is a lot better. So I would definitely recommend applying for the program and just kind of getting that additional insight. Further than that, the classes are pretty easy, so
Yeah.
that helps too. Yeah.
I have just a real quick question. So I'm a math econ, and technically that major is in the math department. Are these like still available?
Yeah,
Definitely.
As long as you take management 1A and 1B, and then I think you finish Econ 11 and you plan to take Econ 101, those I believe are the only requirements you need to do the value investing concentration. I had a friend who was cognitive science and did none of those courses and also got in. So I don't think they look at it very rigorously, but you want to just have those classes down before you apply. And it's a really great way to truthfully get like easy A's and fill up your econ electives. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of like concrete stuff that you can learn by being in the concentration. As he mentioned, you get to speak with really cool investors and learn a lot of things. So, as promised, as a part of this workshop, I would also be sending resources your way, so things that I've collected over time. So now that we have a sense of how to go about the recruiting process, and now that we understand the elements that are involved in succeeding, I can sort of give you a quick preview of some of the resources that I use during recruiting that I think might be helpful for you, even now as freshmen or when you become sophomores. So I have the full suite of Breaking Into Wall Street guides. You're technically supposed to pay for them, but the PDFs are pretty widely available, so I'm just going to share them with you. There is like the Wall Street Prep Red Book, which is a great way to sort of look at all the technicals in one place as well. And I also have the question banks for specific firms that were passed to me by other students who went through those interview processes, right? So this is the question bank that Moelis uses when they do their interviews. There's a question bank that Evercore has. And I also have all the questions that JP Morgan asks in their hire views, right? So these things are things that you can read if you have those interviews coming up, and they're also just a great way to get practice in. I also have a couple of spreadsheets that I use during recruiting that I think are quite helpful and hopefully will be a resource for you guys when you do recruiting. I have like this quote unquote master spreadsheet with like a recruiting tracker that I'm going to send out. I also have a spreadsheet full of questions that I wrote over time. And I already sent out the sheet full of like boutique firms that you can reach out to gain internship experience as first years. So you've already seen that, but these are kind of the main spreadsheets that I relied on when I was a freshman. Another thing that I have is specific interview questions from specific firms that I've collected over the years. So I have access to a database of questions that people were asked during their interviews. So we recently hit like 100 of these. And then so you'll see like interview questions for firms like Citi in New York, or Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong, or Evercore in New York, or Insight Partners, or BlackRock, right? So these things I can sort of share with you. So if you have these interviews coming up, you can like reference these questions and prepare for them ahead of time. I'm also in the process of making a database of people at UCLA who are in finance. So this is just a list of some of the people in the class of 2026. So that's my class, the seniors. And where their offers are. So for example, if you're like really interested in like doing like biotech banking at like Centerview Partners, you can reach out to like Harry over here. She used to be on the investment banking workshop board, and just like reach out for a coffee chat, because I wanted to make it a little bit easier for you guys to find people to reach out to and build your network from there. And so zooming out, let's sort of take stock of what we covered today, right? So it really boils down to this idea that succeeding in the recruiting process has to do with how well you're able to build your profile, how well you can prepare for the process, and how well you perform during networking and interviews, right? To build up your profile, you really want to do internships. That's the main thing that'll build up your resume. And to prepare for the process, you want to brush up on your interview skills by reading the guides and developing a network of people that will support you and doing mock interviews. And to perform well during networking and interviews, you want to make sure that you have good etiquette in your cold emails, that you do a lot of coffee chats, and you're doing a lot of mock interviews so that you're polished when you do your actual interviews, right? And so if you go through this process and you decide to do investment banking, like that's like a hypothetical career trajectory of someone who does investment banking, something that's pretty typical, right? So you have your first year in banking, and then you do 2 years, maybe you move on to private equity, maybe you decide to go to business school, or you decide to start your own business or go into the corporate side. But regardless, right, you can see that you're being very well compensated. You learn a ton about the business world. You learn a ton about finance. You develop a lot of like applicable skills that you can bring to almost any other job. And overall, it's like a really great path. So highly recommend that you pursue it. And hopefully the information that I presented, has been helpful for that so far. And, just to have all of the content that we talked about in one place, so you can sort of see it on one slide. We talk about, the main things you want to think about with your profile. So again, having those relevant internships and extracurricular activities, and making sure that's all presented very nicely on your LinkedIn and your resume. Making sure you're prepared with your technicals and your behaviorals, and you've done your research on the firms. And then performing well in networking and interviews by doing a lot of practice and being thoughtful about the way that you approach things. So as we look at the entire program in its totality, in the first session, we talked about what the financial services industry does, what role it plays in the world, and how finance can be a really interesting path and a way to sort of learn about how the world works and how money works. And so you can explore that through clubs like BVI or BAM or BHF, but you don't need to be a part of those clubs in order to do that. We talked about what investment bankers do in terms of how they engage in like financial transactions like M&A or like capital markets and things like that. And we talked about the different kinds of banks that are out there. And I think very importantly, we also talked about why people choose to pursue investment banking and why people choose not to. So most people do it because they want to learn, they want exit opportunities, and most people choose not to because maybe they're not interested or they don't want to work those long hours. And so for this session, we talked about, the importance of developing a strong profile, the importance of being prepared, and how to perform well. And, hopefully with all of that, you guys all have a better sense of how to approach that process. So looking forward, this is our last session, so we will not be meeting next week, but still make sure to be engaged with UBS because we do have events coming up, and I think a lot of ways that we can support you as students. And so if this is where your journey with investment banking ends because you've decided that this is not what you want to pursue, thank you so much for being a part of this audience. But if you want to continue to pursue this field, welcome to the community, and don't hesitate to reach out. And so thank you very much. I'm going to leave some time for questions and also the QR code in case you want to scan that if you haven't had your email collected already. And yeah, thank you for your time. I'm going to be up here, and Cyrus is going to be up here with me as well, just answering whatever question you guys might have. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.